The bell above the door hadn't finished its chime when Donald Morrison decided how her story would end. March 1963, Russell, Kansas. The fluorescent lights in Morrison's John Deere dealership hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across rows of green tractors that gleamed like promises no one had asked her to believe in. Emily Brennan stood just inside the threshold, 20 years old, wearing her father's work jacket with the sleeves rolled twice. The fabric still carried the ghost of his cologne, mixed with machine oil and Kansas dirt. Donald Morrison looked up from his oak desk. His eyes moved across her in less than a heartbeat. Too young, too small, too female. The calculation complete before she'd taken 3 steps. Then came the laugh. Not the polite kind you swallow when you realize your mistake. The kind that makes other men turn their heads to see who's being put in their place. 3 farmers near the display tractors glanced over. One nudged another. Donald's smile stretched wide, showing teeth that had never known a day of real work. "Can I help you, sweetheart?" The showroom smelled of fresh paint and leather seats, an opportunity that wasn't meant for everyone. Emily's hand stayed at her side steady despite the heat climbing to her chest, spreading across her face like shame she hadn't earned. "I need a tractor, something that can handle 240 acres. Donald set his pen down, slowly, leaning back in his chair like a man with all the time in the world and none of it wasted on surprise. "I heard about your daddy." A pause calculated. "Robert was a good customer. Thank you. He studied her the way you study a problem already solved. The kind that doesn't require much thought because you've seen it a dozen times before." His hands rested on the desk clean and smooth. No calluses, no scars from metal or wire or anything that fought back. "So what are you planning to do with the farm?" "Farm it." The smile changed. Not gone. Sharper, like a blade turned at a different angle. "By yourself?" "Yes, sir." He let out a breath that carried the weight of explaining something obvious to someone who wouldn't understand anyway. "You're 20 years old. That place nearly broke your father, and he knew what he was doing. That's not a one-person job. And it's sure not a job for," he caught himself, "but barely. For you." Emily didn't answer. The quiet stretch between them, filled only by the hum of lights and the low murmur of farmers pretending not to listen. Donald continued, his voice taking on the patient tone of a man doing someone a favor. "You've got options. Lease it out. Stephen Fletcher's been looking to expand. He'd give you a fair price. Or better yet, sell it. Take the money. Get a place in town. You're a pretty girl. You'll find a husband. Let him handle the hard part." There are moments when a person decides who they're going to be, and most of the time nobody else notices when it happens. Emily looked at Donald's hands again. Then she thought about her father's hands. The ones that could pull a calf in the dark and fix a broken line before the sun came up. Hands that didn't need to explain themselves. "Do you have a used tractor for sale or not?" Donald sighed, but he turned back to business, flipping through papers on his desk. "I've got a 1958 John Deere 730, 12,000. Good machine. I can finance it. 10% down, 7 years, 9% interest." The math came quick in her head the way it always did. No paper needed, 160 a month, close to 2,000 a year. Overtime, more than 15,000 for a $12,000 tractor. "That's more than I can spend. That's what it costs. Farming isn't cheap." "I'm not trying to compete. I'm trying to stay." Donald stood walking around the desk. His hand landed on her shoulder, heavy and warm through the thin jacket. "Emily, your father left you land in a broken tractor. That's not a plan. That's a problem. The smartest thing you can do is step away before it takes you down with it." She stepped back just enough that his hand fell away. "My father taught me something. People who tell you what you can't do usually don't want to watch you try." She turned and walked toward the door. Behind her, the laughter came again, lower this time, directed at someone else in the showroom. She heard the words that followed spoken just loud enough. "Little girl thinks she's gonna farm." Emily pushed through the door. The spring wind hit her face cold and sharp. She didn't stop. Kept walking to the truck, parked at the curb, climbed in, started the engine. Her hands gripped the wheel knuckles, pale against the dark leather. She didn't drive away immediately. sat there breathing hard, the humiliation sitting in her chest like a stone. But underneath it, something else. Something that felt like the first spark before a fire catches. The funeral had been 4 days earlier. Small, quiet, 30 people in folding chairs at the church. Pastor Williams spoke about hard work and faith in the land that outlasts us all. Emily had sat in the front row, hands folded in her lap, eyes dry. She didn't cry. Not there, not where people could see it and decide what it meant. Her father, Robert Brennan, had been 58 when the stroke took him. Fast, they said. Like that made it easier. He'd farmed 240 acres west of Russell for most of his life, working soil that fought back every season. He wasn't a big man, not loud, not the kind people remembered for talk. He was the kind they remembered when they needed something done right. Emily's mother, Margaret, had died when Emily was 7. After that, it was just the two of them. Robert raised her alone, and he didn't raise her soft. By 12, she could drive a tractor straight across a field without drifting. By 14, she could weld a busted frame back together. By the time she was grown, she understood soil the way most people understood weather, by watching, by paying attention to what wasn't obvious, by trusting patterns that took years to reveal themselves. What Robert left behind wasn't money. It was land. A house with a leaking roof and a porch step that had been broken since winter. A 1955 John Deere 60 sitting in the shed with a seized engine that hadn't turned over in 2 years. $847 in a bank account at Russell First National. A boss of a paper Emily hadn't opened yet because opening it meant accepting that he was gone and she was alone and the future had arrived whether she was ready or not. The day after the funeral, Emily sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her. The numbers didn't lie. 847 minus funeral expenses of 215 left 632. Minus 3 months of back property taxes at 340 left 292. $292 between her and losing everything Robert had built. She needed a tractor. She needed seed. She needed fuel and parts, and time she didn't have. The bank wouldn't loan to a 20-year-old woman with no collateral beyond land that was barely paid off and equipment that didn't run. She'd already asked. The loan officer had been polite but firm. Come back with a co-signer, preferably a husband. Emily closed the ledger. Outside the window, the field stretched empty under gray March sky. She could walk away, get a job at the diner in town, serve coffee and collect tips, rent a small apartment above the hardware store, let the land go to auction, let someone else deal with the weight of it. Easy, safe, dead. 2 weeks after Morrison's dealership, Emily drove 40 miles east to a farm auction in Ellsworth County. She had $1,100 in cash scraped together by selling her mother's jewelry and her father's pickup truck. The auction wasn't advertised widely, just a small notice in the county paper. Estate sale, farm equipment, no reserve. The morning was cold wind coming hard off open fields. 30 people stood in clusters, men mostly hands in pockets, breath visible in the air. 2 tractors sat off to the side on a patch of gravel, a 1949 Farmall M and a 1953 Farmall Super M. Both faded red paint peeling tires cracked. The kind of machines people stopped seeing years ago because they had already decided the machines were worthless. Emily saw something different. She saw equipment she understood, the same kind her father had run, the same kind she'd learned on. She knew what they sounded like when they were right. She knew what they needed when they weren't. An older farmer stood near the fence watching the crowd. George White, she'd seen him at the feed store in Russell, though they'd never spoken. He was watching her now, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his cap. The auctioneer started high on the first tractor. 2,000. No one moved. He dropped it to 1,500. Silence. 1,200. Nothing. Emily raised her hand. 400. The auctioneer paused, looking at her for the first time. Then he nodded. 400. I've got 400. Do I hear 5? No one bid. The hammer came down. Sold. The Super M drew more interest. Another bidder, a farmer in a worn canvas coat, pushed it up twice. Emily countered each time. 600. The man hesitated, looking at the tractor, calculating something in his head. Then he shook his head and stepped back. Sold 600? Emily had spent $1,000. She had 100 left. No bank, no backup, no one coming to help if the math didn't work. After the sale, George White walked over. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the tractors, then at her. You know what you bought? Yes, sir. You know the M needs a clutch. The Super M needs its fuel system, rebuilt new wiring, and the hydraulics are shot. Emily's stomach dropped. She'd known about the clutch. She'd seen the wiring. But the hydraulics, that was going to cost more than she'd planned, more than she had. Your father teach you. He did. George nodded slowly, not impressed, not surprised, just measuring. Then you might make it. Might. He walked away without another word. Emily stood there in the wind, looking at the two tractors that were now hers. $1,000 for machines that might not run even after she fixed them. $100 left in her pocket, and winter waiting on the other side of whatever came next. The workshop was cold in the mornings, frost on the windows, concrete floor like ice through the soles of her boots. Emily started with the Farmall M. The clutch was worse than she thought. She pulled it apart over 6 days, working in dim light from a bare bulb, fingers splitting at the knuckles oil, working its way under her nails where soap couldn't reach. She ordered parts from a catalog. The clutch disc cost $40, pressure plate $30, throwout bearing $12. When the box arrived, she opened it on the workbench and found the wrong pressure plate. Different bolt pattern. She'd have to send it back. Wait another week. Pay for shipping both ways. $45 wasted on a mistake she should have caught. The Super M was worse. The fuel pump rebuild required parts she couldn't identify from the manual's grainy diagrams. She guessed, ordered what looked right. When they arrived, she installed them, turned the key. Nothing. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over. She spent another $60 on hydraulic seals before realizing she'd mixed incompatible fluids, damaging the system she was trying to fix. Another week lost, another lesson learned the hard way. One afternoon, taking a break from the Super M, Emily opened the glove box to check for paperwork. A folded note fell out, yellowed and brittle. Her father's handwriting. Series reliable if you treat her right. Check hydraulics before summer heat. Emily sat on the shop stool holding the note. He'd known. Somehow he'd known she'd end up with one of these machines. Or maybe he'd just written it years ago, tucking reminders into every tractor he worked on, leaving breadcrumbs for a future he couldn't see. She folded the note carefully and put it back. Patricia Porter showed up on a Saturday afternoon in late March, driving her husband's Chevrolet. She'd been Emily's closest friend in high school, back when the future felt like something you could choose instead of something that chose you. Patricia had married James Porter in 1961, a week after graduation. Now she was pregnant with their first child, 6 months along, wearing a blue maternity dress that looked new. She brought a casserole still warm, wrapped in a dish towel. Emily, I heard about your dad. I'm so sorry. Emily wiped her hands on a rag, leaving streaks of grease. Thank you. Patricia looked past her into the workshop at the tractors and pieces, at the parts scattered across the workbench. What are you doing? Rebuilding. Patricia's face shifted, something between concern and confusion. Emily, you don't have to do this. James's brother works at the co-op. He could probably get you a job. Office work, filing, answering phones. It's steady. I'm not looking for a job. But you're out here alone. Patricia's hand rested on her belly, unconscious, protective. Emily, this is too much for one person. It's what I've got. Patricia's eyes held something Emily couldn't name. I'm going to have a baby. I'm building something too. I know. The words sat between them, true but incomplete. Patricia's something and Emily's something didn't look the same, didn't feel the same, didn't lead to the same place. Patricia must have felt it too, because she didn't stay long after that. She left the casserole on the porch step and drove away, dust trailing behind the Chevrolet. Emily ate the casserole cold that night, standing at the kitchen counter, too tired to heat it, too tired to sit. 3 weeks later, both tractors ran. Not smoothly, not perfectly, but well enough. The Farmall M coughed black smoke for the first 10 minutes, then settled into a rough idle. The Super M's hydraulics leaked, but they held pressure. Emily's hands were permanently stained, two fingers bandaged from cuts that wouldn't close. But the machines worked. Spring planting started in April. 120 acres of wheat had already been in the ground before Robert died, planted late the previous fall. Emily put the other 120 acres into sorghum. She worked alone dawn to dark, running the Farmall M in straight lines across fields that stretched longer every time she turned around. She made mistakes, overlapped rows, missed spots, had to go back and fill gaps. The work took twice as long as it should have. Neighbors drove past slower than usual, slowing down to watch. Word traveled fast in Russell County. The Brennan girl out there by herself. Won't last through summer. At the feed store, Emily heard a man say it while she stood at the back counter waiting for her order. She won't make it to harvest. Someone ought to talk some sense into her. She paid for her seed and carried the 50-pound bag to the truck herself, feeling the man's eyes on her back the whole way. Church became harder. The women whispered in the fellowship hall, after service voices dropping when Emily walked past. She stopped going in May. Sundays became another workday. Patricia stopped visiting as often. When she did come, the conversation stayed surface level. Careful, like stepping around something broken on the floor that neither of them wanted to name. In June, Donald Morrison drove out to the farm. He found Emily under the Super M, lying on her back in the dirt, replacing a hydraulic line that had cracked. Emily? She slid out, wiping her hands on her jeans. What do you need, Mr. Morrison? He looked around the yard. The two old tractors. The field beyond. Rows of green sorghum pushing up through dark soil. People are worried about you. People are talking about me. That's not the same thing. Donald took a step closer, his voice lowering like that would make the words easier to hear. Those tractors aren't going to hold up. They're old. Parts are getting harder to find. One bad breakdown at the wrong time and you lose your crop. They'll hold. I know how to keep them running. Your father thought the same thing, and his machine failed him. The words landed hard. Emily felt them in her chest, sharp and deliberate. But she didn't step back. My father's tractor ran longer than most. These haven't failed yet. I'll take my chances. Donald shook his head. Not angry, just certain. The certainty of a man who'd seen this story before and knew how it ended. I hope you know what you're doing. I do. He left. Emily went back under the tractor. Her shoulders didn't sag. Her breathing didn't quicken. She just kept working because stopping meant thinking about what he'd said, and thinking about it wouldn't change the fact that he might be right. September brought harvest. The wheat came in first. Yields decent, but not great. The sorghum took longer. Mid-harvest, the Super M broke down in the middle of the field. Fuel line cracked, spraying diesel across hot metal. Emily climbed down, grabbed her tools from the truck, and fixed it right there. 4 hours with the sun beating down, losing half a day, but saving the harvest. When it was done, she'd brought in enough to sell. Not great, not terrible, good enough. The grain elevator paid her $3,200. She subtracted seed costs, fuel parts, property taxes, insurance, miscellaneous repairs. Net profit, $1,680. She put $1,500 in the bank, kept $180 for emergencies. $1,500 saved. She needed $50,000 to feel safe. At this rate, 30 more years. She was 20 years old. That night, Emily ate dinner standing at the counter. Leftover beans, bread she'd baked 3 days ago. She looked at the bank book lying on the table, looked at the fields through the window, dark now, just shapes against darker sky. 30 more years. If everything went right. If nothing broke that she couldn't fix. If prices held, if the weather cooperated, if she didn't get sick, if no one found a way to take it from her. Too many ifs for anyone who wanted to sleep easy. She slept anyway because there wasn't another choice. Winter came cold and stayed that way. The house felt bigger in the quiet, the spaces where her father used to be more obvious when there wasn't work to fill the hours. Emily kept herself busy, maintenance on the tractors, going over the books, reading farm reports from Kansas State, learning about new seed varieties and soil amendments and market forecasts that all assumed you had money to experiment with. One afternoon in December, cleaning the workshop, Emily tried to open the bottom drawer of her father's workbench. It stuck something, jamming it from inside. She pulled harder. The drawer wouldn't budge. She'd come back to it later. Right now, she needed to finish rebuilding the Farmall M before the temperature dropped below freezing tonight. February arrived with wind that worked its way through every crack in the house, making the windows rattle, the doors shift in their frames. Emily spent her evenings at the kitchen table with the ledger planning for spring. Seed costs were up. Fuel was up. Parts were up. Everything cost more than the year before, but grain prices hadn't moved. The math was tighter, margins thinner. One bad year would erase everything she'd saved. She closed the ledger and looked at the bank book again. 1,500. It looked solid on paper, but she knew better. Numbers could look sturdy when they weren't. That night, she remembered the stuck drawer in the workshop. She'd been meaning to fix it for weeks, kept putting it off. Tomorrow, she decided, tomorrow she'd force it open, see what was jamming it, clear it out. Tomorrow came cold and clear, the kind of bright winter morning that hurts your eyes and makes the frost on the grass look like scattered diamonds. Emily went to the workshop after breakfast coffee, still warm in her stomach, breath visible in the cold air. She knelt in front of the workbench, gripped the drawer handle, and yanked. Nothing. She braced her foot against the bench frame and pulled harder. The wood groaned. Something inside shifted. She pulled again, putting her weight into it. The drawer broke free, suddenly sliding out so fast she nearly fell backward. Inside, packed tight, were dozens of small notebooks, receipts bundled with rubber bands, loose papers covered in her father's handwriting, and beneath it all, a leather journal worn soft from years of handling. No label on the cover. Emily lifted it out carefully. The leather was warm, almost alive in her hands. She opened to the first page. Her father's handwriting neat and precise. Year 1 field notes. If you're reading this, I didn't get to show you. Her throat tightened. She kept reading. She read for 3 days, lived inside her father's mind through ink and paper. 23 years of field notes, soil samples, rotation maps, yield comparisons that proved what neighbors called luck was actually strategy. Cover crops weren't waste. They were investment. Organic matter wasn't abstract science. It was water retention during drought, root depth during heat, resilience when weather turned hostile. The final entry had been written in a shakier hand addressed to her. Emmy, if you're reading this, I didn't finish. The land is better than it looks. I've been building it for you. Trust the soil. It won't let you down. That night, Emily cried for the first time since the funeral. Not from grief alone, from understanding. She hadn't inherited a burden. She'd inherited 23 years of preparation. Spring planting in 1964 looked different through the lens of the journal. Emily followed her father's rotation exactly. The wheat acreage went where he'd noted the soil held moisture longest, sorghum in the sections that drained better. And after harvest, instead of leaving the stubble to winter over, she planted cover crops. Clover in the north sections, rye in the south. Stephen Fletcher stopped his truck on the road one afternoon, leaning out the window to watch her seeding clover. You planting something you ain't gonna sell, planting something for the soil. His face creased in confusion. Your daddy did that too. Never made sense to me. Did it make sense when his yields were better than yours? Stephen's jaw tightened. He put the truck in gear without answering, gravel crunching under tires as he drove away. The years that followed blurred together in the rhythm of seasons. Good seasons and bad, profits small but steady, the bank account growing by increments that felt insignificant until you looked back and saw the distance covered. 1968 brought 2,400 profit, bank account 5,100. 1970 and 2,800 profit, account and 10,300. 1972, 3,100, account 18,700. Emily turned 30 in 1973. She saw Patricia at church one Sunday in spring, rare for both of them now. Patricia had 4 children, the youngest still in diapers, the oldest starting school. She looked exhausted, hair pulled back without care, dress wrinkled from being sat on by small hands. Emily looked the same as she had at 25. Worn, yes, weathered, but strong, solid. Patricia's eyes held something Emily hadn't seen before. Not pity, not concern, jealousy. They spoke briefly in the parking lot, surface-level pleasantries about weather and spring planning, but the real conversation happened in silence, in the way Patricia's gaze moved across Emily's face, looking for cracks for evidence that the path Emily had chosen had cost her something visible. Finding none, Patricia got in her car and drove away first. Then 1971 arrived like a fist. May came dry. June came drier. By July, Emily had gone 68 days without rain. The wheat suffered. The sorghum suffered worse. Other farms in Russell County lost 40 to 50% of their crops. Emily watched her neighbors' fields turn brown and crack. Watched combines sit idle because there was nothing to harvest. Her fields held better. Not great, not miraculous, but better. The soil her father had built held moisture longer. The deeper root systems of plants grown in healthier earth reached water that other crops couldn't touch. Where neighbors lost half, she lost 20%. But 20% of a small operation was still a loss. That year, Emily netted negative $1,800. The bank account dropped to $8,900, the first time it had gone backward in 3 years. She learned something that season the journal hadn't taught her. Even good soil isn't magic. Weather can still hurt you. Planning can still fail. All you can do is give yourself the best chance and hope it's enough. In 1976, the tractors finally forced Emily's hand. Both machines were now 23 and 27 years old, held together by repairs and stubbornness and morning prayers that the engines would turn over one more time. The Farmall M needed a complete engine overhaul. The Super M's transmission was failing grinding gears that shouldn't grind leaking fluid from seals that had given up. Emily got quotes from 3 mechanics. The lowest was $3,400 to rebuild both machines properly. The alternative was buying replacements. Used tractors started at $8,000. New ones cost $18,000. She chose the rebuild, spending 8 weeks in the shop with a mechanic named Frank, who worked slow and charged by the hour but did the work right. The Farmall M got new pistons, rings, valves, timing chain. The Super M got a rebuilt transmission, new clutch, overhauled hydraulics. When it was done, both tractors ran smoother than they had in a decade. Not new, but renewed. Good for another 10 years if she took care of them. The $3,400 hurt, dropping her account to $28,000. But it was the right decision. She knew it the first morning. Both machines started on the first crank engines, settling into that steady diesel rhythm that meant everything was balanced and true. Christopher Holland found her at the co-op in 1975, cornering her by the seed display with a smile that showed too many teeth. Emily, you've got 240 acres. You farming all of it yourself. Planning to? Thing is, I'm looking to expand. If you ever want to lease some out, I'd pay fair, $15 an acre, cash up front each spring. Emily did the math. 60 acres at 15 meant $900. That was half a year's profit for doing nothing. For letting someone else work ground she'd be working anyway. She needed the money. Her savings sat at just over $2,000. Not enough, not nearly enough. What would you plant? Christopher shrugged. Whatever makes sense. Probably wheat, maybe milo. Standard rotation. A pause, then casually. No cover crops, though. Can't sell cover crops. Don't see the point in planting something that doesn't pay. Emily hesitated. The journal's instructions were clear. Cover crops mattered. But $900 mattered too, and she was barely holding on as it was. 60 acres, south section, 1-year lease to start. They shook on it. No lawyers, no formal contract. Just a handwritten agreement. Emily drew up at the kitchen table, both of them signing at the bottom. Payment due April 1st. Land returned in same condition or better. Christopher paid on time that first year. The cash felt good in her hand, real and immediate. She watched him work the section, running it hard with older equipment. No cover crops after harvest. The soil looked different when she walked the boundary line that fall. Darker where she farmed, lighter where he did. But the difference wasn't dramatic enough to worry about yet. Year 2, Christopher was late with payment. 3 weeks late. Emily drove to his place, a farmhouse that needed paint and a yard full of equipment in various states of disrepair. Rent's due, Chris. He was working on a tractor and engine hands black with oil. I know. Had some unexpected costs. Get it to you next week. Contract says April 1st. Contract also says don't be unreasonable. His tone had changed, the easy charm replaced with something harder. Next week. Promise. He paid 10 days later, counting out bills that smelled like cigarette smoke. Emily took the money without comment. But when she walked her section that summer, she saw the soil compaction starting. Erosion in the spots where he'd worked the ground too wet. She told him to ease up. He said he knew what he was doing. Year 3, Christopher didn't pay at all. April passed, May, June. Emily left messages at his place, no response. Finally, she drove over in July, found him loading hay. You owe me $900. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. Farm's been tight, you know how it is. Contract's clear. Payment was due April 1st. Sue me then. The words came out casual, almost bored. You got a contract that says what farm it good, that ain't legal language, honey. Try taking that to court and see where it gets you. Emily felt heat rise in her chest, anger mixing with the sick realization that he was right. The contract was too vague, written by someone who assumed good faith on both sides. She'd made a mistake, a bad one. She hired a lawyer in Russell, a man named Walter Price who worked out of a small office above the pharmacy. The consultation cost $50 she couldn't spare. He read the contract, shook his head. It's not great, but he owes you rent. And if you can prove damages to the land, you might get something. The trial took 1 day in county court. Christopher showed up with his own lawyer, a younger man from Salina, who talked fast and smiled at the judge like they were old friends. Emily sat at the plaintiff's table with Walter wearing the same dress she'd worn to her father's funeral because it was the only nice thing she owned. The judge ruled from the bench after hearing both sides. Contract too vague to enforce specific farming practices. But rent was owed. Christopher had to pay $900 plus $300 in damages for soil degradation. No penalty, no interest, just what was owed. Emily's legal fees came to $640. Net recovery, $560. She'd spent more than she'd gained, lost 3 years of building that section's soil, and learned that a handshake wasn't worth the breath it took to agree. Patricia stopped by that evening, finding Emily in the workshop organizing tools she'd already organized twice. James heard about the lawsuit. Word travels. Patricia sat on the stool by the workbench, hands folded in her lap. This is why I worry about you. A husband could have handled that, could have dealt with Christopher, handled the lawyer, all of it. Or I could learn to handle it myself. You're so hard now, Emily. Don't you ever want something easier? Easy isn't the same as worth it. Patricia left without finishing her coffee for the second time in as many years. The friendship was cooling ice forming at the edges, and both of them could feel it. By 1980, Emily had $92,000 in the bank. Her yields continued to outperform the county average. Wheat County averaged 35 bushels per acre. Emily's averaged 40. That 5-bushel difference multiplied by 120 acres, multiplied by 350 a bushel, meant $2,100 extra income per year. Over 10 years, that gap alone accounted for $21,000 of her savings. The rest came from what she didn't spend. No new equipment, no hired help, no debt service. Living small, living careful, living within margins that let her weather storms that were still building on a horizon she could sense but not yet see clearly. In late 1980, a letter arrived from the county assessor's office. Standard envelope, official letterhead, nothing that suggested the bomb it contained. Emily opened it, standing at the kitchen table reading while her coffee went cold. Property tax assessment for 240 acres. Standard language about valuations and rates. Then in the third paragraph, a note about an outstanding lien from 1961. Balance due $8,700. Payment required within 90 days or property subject to tax auction. Emily read it 3 times. Her father had borrowed against the land 19 years ago. Paid some back, but not all. Carried that debt silently, never mentioning it, protecting her from the knowledge that the farm wasn't quite free and clear. The amount had grown with penalties and compounded interest. What started as $2,400 had become $8,700. 90 days to pay or lose everything. Emily sat down slowly, the letter still in her hand. Her savings, $92,000. The demand, $8,700. She could pay it, barely, but it would wipe out nearly a decade of careful accumulation. The anger came first. Why didn't he tell her? Then understanding. He was protecting her, carrying that weight alone so she wouldn't have to. And finally, action. She wrote a check for $8,700, walked it to the county office herself, got a receipt stamped and signed proving the lien was satisfied. Her bank account dropped to $83,200. A setback, but not a disaster. More importantly, a lesson. Even her father wasn't perfect. Even people who plan carefully make mistakes, carry burdens, hide weakness behind strength. The world started changing in 1981. Shifts so gradual at first you could convince yourself they didn't mean anything. Interest rates that had been 8–9% started climbing. 10%, 12, 15. Grain prices that had been strong for a decade began to soften. Wheat dropped from $4.50 a bushel to $4.20, then $4, then $3.80. Land values that had risen steady for 20 years stalled. Then they started falling, not dramatically, not yet. Just enough that farmers who'd bought at peak prices were suddenly underwater, owing more than their land was worth. Brian Carson tried to refinance his equipment loans in spring of 1981. The bank said no. He sold 80 acres at a loss to cover the shortfall, still owed $60,000. Donald Morrison's dealership slowed. Sales dropped. Inventory sat longer. Farmers who'd been eager buyers 6 months ago were suddenly cautious, asking for better terms, stretching payments, returning equipment they couldn't afford to keep. Stephen Fletcher approached Emily at church one Sunday in late summer, one of the few times both of them had shown up. He looked older than his 53 years, face drawn, shoulders tight. "Emily, I need advice." "What's going on?" "I'm carrying too much. Interest rates went from 8 to 18. My payment more than doubled. I can't cover it." "Can you sell some land?" "At what price values are down 30%? I'd still owe more than I'd clear." "I'm sorry, Stephen. Your daddy was smarter than all of us." He walked away before she could respond, moving through the parking lot like a man going to a funeral. Spring of 1982 came cold and stayed that way. Emily told herself she needed feed from town. That much was true. What she didn't say to herself was that she'd been thinking about Russell for a week, thinking about one building in particular, thinking about how simple it would be to stop fighting something that never let go of her for even one day. She drove in after breakfast, the truck's heater barely working, her gloves stiff with cold. The feed store was on the east side of town, but she didn't turn there first. She drove past it, past the hardware store, slower as she approached Morrison's John Deere dealership. The sign still stood straight, green paint, clean windows. But fewer tractors sat out front now, the lot looking emptier than it should. Emily pulled over across the street, left the engine running. For warmth, she told herself. Just for warmth. She put both hands on the wheel and stared through the windshield at the front door. Farmers came and went, fewer than there used to be. Men in work coats moving with less purpose, less certainty. They walked in like they weren't sure they belonged there anymore. Emily sat there and thought about what surrender would look like if it arrived dressed as common sense. It wouldn't feel dramatic. That was the truth she admitted to herself. It would feel like relief. She could walk across the street right now. Donald would look up, maybe not smile this time, but he'd listen. She'd tell him she'd changed her mind, ask if he knew anyone who wanted to lease the ground. Of course he would. Someone always wanted more land. The papers would get drawn up. The money would come once a year. She could keep the house, get a job in town, maybe at the grain elevator office, maybe at the diner, maybe one of the shops on Main Street. She wouldn't have to wake in the dark wondering what broke overnight, wouldn't have to listen to the wind and calculate how it would affect the crop, the machinery the next season. She reached for the door handle, fingers wrapping around cold metal. Her reflection stared back from the side mirror. Robert's jacket still too big, still worn at the elbows. Dirt worked into the creases of her hands that no amount of scrubbing would remove. Calluses split along her palm. She looked tired. She looked scared. She looked like someone with every reason in the world to step away. And then she saw something else. Not in the glass exactly, in memory. Her father at the sink after supper, washing his hands slowly, looking out the window toward the Westfield. That small expression he got when the work was his and he knew it. Not pride exactly, something quieter, satisfaction. He'd said once years ago while tightening a bolt on the old farm mall, "Land don't ask if you're ready, just ask what you're going to do next." At the time, she'd thought it was one of those things older people said because they'd lived long enough to make plain facts sound important. Sitting in the truck now, she heard it the way he'd meant it, not as encouragement, as responsibility. The farm didn't care whether she doubted herself. The season would come regardless. The ground would need what it needed. The only question was whether she'd still be there when it did. Emily's hand came off the door handle. She sat back against the seat. The shame of how close she'd come hit first, sharp and immediate, then anger. Not at Donald or the men who'd laughed, but at herself for almost giving away the decision in a warm office before the year had even tested her fully. Then even that passed. What remained was simpler, stripped down to its core. She put the truck in gear, didn't look at the dealership again. Drove to the feed store, bought what she'd come for, loaded it herself, headed home. She never told anyone about that morning. Not because she was embarrassed, though maybe part of her was. She kept it quiet because she knew what people did with stories after the fact. They cleaned them up. They made strength look continuous. They liked to imagine that people who made it through hard years always knew they would. Emily knew better. She hadn't known, not that morning, not most mornings if she was honest. What kept her going wasn't confidence or certainty or even pride. It was smaller than that, less noble, usually left out of the stories because it didn't sound heroic. She just went home and kept working. That was all. That was enough for now. By 1982, the auctions weren't occasional anymore. They were part of the calendar, scheduled like any other seasonal event. Russell County had 3 in March alone. People stopped asking if there would be one and started asking whose place was next. The statistics told one story. Farm foreclosures up 300% across Kansas. Land values down 40% from their 1979 peak. Interest rates still hovering between 15 and 18. Grain prices still depressed. Wheat at $3.80 a bushel when it cost $4 to grow. But numbers on paper couldn't capture what it felt like to stand in a farmyard and watch equipment get sold for pennies on the dollar. Emily went to Stephen Fletcher's auction in April. She didn't want to go. Drove there anyway because not going felt like pretending it wasn't happening, and pretending didn't change anything. The equipment lined up in rows, organized by type. Tractors, combines, plows, planters. $250,000 worth of machinery when Stephen bought it. The auctioneer estimated it would bring 80, maybe 90 if bidding went well. It brought 76. Stephen stood near the barn with his wife and their 2 teenagers, watching people they'd known for decades pick through their lives like a yard sale. His wife was crying quietly, trying to hide it. Stephen's face showed nothing. Gone blank the way people go blank when feeling anything would break them. Emily bought nothing, just stood in the back bearing witness. This could have been her. Would have been her if she'd done what everyone said. Expanded when land was cheap, leveraged when credit was easy, believed that good times were permanent. The only difference between her and Stephen was that he'd borrowed in 1974 when it made sense, when everyone was doing it, when the future looked certain. She'd stayed small because her father's journal had taught her that soil built slowly and debt destroyed quickly. The breaking point came different for everyone, but it came. Spring of 1983 brought the auction that changed everything. Richard Brewer's place, 160 acres adjacent to Emily's southern boundary. Land Richard had bought in 1976 for $140,000, leveraged at 80%. Good ground, well maintained. No different from 100 other farms, except that Richard had believed the story everyone was telling about endless growth and permanent prosperity. The auction was held on a Saturday morning in May. Air still cool, sky clear. Emily stood in the crowd of about 40 people, most of them looking without the money to buy. The auctioneer started high on the land itself, 100,000, no response. Dropped to 80, silence. 60,000 brought a few shifted feet, people reconsidering, calculating. Emily raised her hand at 55,000. An older farmer she didn't know countered at 60. Emily went to 65. The man hesitated, looking at his wife, shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer called once, twice, looked around for other bidders. 68,000, Emily's voice carrying across the yard, final and certain. The hammer came down. Sold. Cash payment due within 30 days. The whisper started immediately. People turning to look at her, recognition dawning. That's the Brennan girl. Where'd she get that kind of money? Thought she was barely holding on like the rest of us. Donald Morrison stood near the back hat, pulled low face unreadable. He watched Emily sign the preliminary papers. Watched her shake hands with Richard's lawyer. Watched her walk to her truck without celebration or triumph on her face. Emily felt none of what people might have expected. No victory, no satisfaction. Just sadness for Richard, who'd worked hard and planned as best he could and failed anyway. And underneath that, a cold, pragmatic understanding. The land needed someone who could take care of it. She could. So she would. The bank transfer cleared in 3 weeks. On June 1st, 1983, Emily Brennan owned 400 acres of Russell County farmland. Every square foot paid for. No debt, no mortgage, no one to answer to except herself and the soil. Over the next 4 years, the pattern repeated. Not every auction, not recklessly, but when good land came available at prices that made sense, Emily bought. 80 acres in 1985 for $31,000. 120 acres in 1987 for $54,000. Each time cash. Each time carefully calculated against what she had saved, what she could afford to spend, without exposing herself to the same vulnerability that was destroying her neighbors. By 1988, she owned 600 acres. The farms around her had consolidated or disappeared, bought up by larger operations from outside the county or by the few like Emily who'd survived with capital intact. The landscape looked different now. Fewer houses with lights on after dark. Fewer tractors in fields. Fewer people who remembered how it used to be. But with expansion came isolation of a different kind. People didn't congratulate Emily on her purchases. They whispered, resentful, bitter. She was profiting from their misery, taking advantage of neighbors at their lowest point. Never mind that she paid fair prices. Never mind that the land would have gone to strangers if she hadn't bought it. Never mind that she'd survived by doing exactly what they'd refused to do, living within her means. The whispers hurt more than she expected. At the feed store, men turned their backs when she walked in. At the grain elevator, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women she'd known her whole life crossed the street to avoid passing her on the sidewalk. Emily understood it. Understood that her success was a mirror held up to their failures. That every acre she bought was proof they'd made the wrong choices. That her presence reminded them of what they'd lost. Understanding didn't make it easier. Donald Morrison's dealership closed on a Thursday morning in late October of 1986. No ceremony, no announcement beyond what the law required for creditors, just doors locked, windows, dark inventory tagged for liquidation. The bank had called his note after 3 years of declining sales and mounting losses. Too many farmers who'd bought equipment couldn't make payments. Too much inventory sitting unsold. The math stopped working, and banks don't wait for sentiment. Donald Morrison was 68 years old. He'd built that business over 25 years. Survived recessions and droughts and market downturns, always believing that the next season would be better. He was wrong. That evening, Emily was in the workshop replacing a belt on the Farmall M when she heard a truck pull into the yard. She stepped outside, saw Donald sitting in a newer Ford engine, idling hands resting on the steering wheel like he was trying to decide something. He looked older, not just in years, but in the way defeat ages people, stripping away the confidence that had held everything else in place. Emily walked over to the truck, leaned against the fender. "I closed the dealership today." "I heard, I'm sorry." Donald let out a breath that might have been a laugh if there had been anything funny left in the world. "You're sorry after everything I told you." Losing something you built is hard. Doesn't matter who you are. He stared straight ahead through the windshield, jaw tight. I told you to sell this place. Told you you didn't belong in it. Told you you'd be back in town in a year. Probably married. Definitely done with farming. You did. I called you a little girl. Said those tractors you bought weren't worth the trouble. Said you'd fail before your first harvest was in. Emily waited. He needed to say this. Needed to put it into words where it could be heard and acknowledged and maybe eventually left behind. I pushed every farmer in this county to take on more than they should have. Made it sound smart. Made it sound like the only way forward. Grow or die, I said. Leverage or fall behind. And now, he didn't finish. The silence completed the thought better than words could have. No one forced them to sign. No, but I made it easy. I believed in the model. Believed bigger was always better. Believed debt was just a tool. Believed the good times would last long enough to make it work. It worked for a while, until it didn't. They sat with that truth for a moment, the weight of it settling between them. Then Donald turned to look at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived. How many acres you got now? 600. All paid for. All paid for. Donald's breath came out slow, deflating, something he'd been holding inside. I spent 20 years telling people what they needed to survive this business. Turns out the only one who had it figured out was the one I laughed at. Emily shook her head once, a small movement. I didn't have it all figured out. I just didn't take on what I couldn't carry. Donald looked at her, then really looked. Not the way he had in that showroom 23 years ago, not with judgment or dismissal, but with something that looked like recognition arriving 2 decades too late. Your father knew. He did. I wish I'd seen it. Wish I'd listened when he tried to tell me about building soil instead of mining it, about patience instead of speed. I thought he was just old-fashioned. A pause. Turns out old-fashioned was the only thing that worked. Donald glanced past her toward the shed where the 2 old tractors sat. Still running, still working. 34 and 38 years old now. Rebuilt and maintained, but fundamentally the same machines she'd bought for $1,000. Those tractors, they still running every day. A faint smile crossed his face. Not amused, not impressed, just something close to respect that had taken a quarter-century to arrive. $1,000 for both. Best investment I ever saw, and I didn't even make it. He put the truck in gear, hesitated like he might say something else, then pulled away without another word. Emily stood in the yard until the sound of his engine faded into the distance, replaced by wind through bare branches and the settling quiet of evening. She didn't feel like she'd won anything. The shape of victory didn't fit the moment. What she felt was smaller, quieter, confirmation that didn't need to be celebrated. Patricia Porter showed up on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1986, driving the same Chevrolet she'd had for 12 years. Rust showing around the wheel wells. Emily was in the workshop when she heard the car door slam. Patricia looked thinner than Emily remembered, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age. Her husband James had lost 80 acres the previous year when his equipment loans came due and the bank refused to refinance. Not a total loss, not like some, but enough to hurt, enough to change things. I heard you bought the Morrison place, Fletcher place, Stevens land. Emily nodded, looking around the workshop at the tools organized on pegboards, the workbench clean, everything in its place. You're doing well. I'm doing what I planned. I used to think you were crazy. Back when we were 20, when I was getting married and having babies, and you were out here covered in grease trying to fix tractors that were older than we were. Emily set down the hydraulic cylinder, wiping her hands on a rag that was already past helping. And now I think I was the crazy one. The words hung between them, honest and raw in a way their conversations hadn't been for years. Patricia's eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, just acknowledging something that had been true for a while but never said out loud. Can we have coffee sometime, real coffee? Not the kind where we pretend everything's fine. I'd like that. Patricia came back 3 days later. They sat at Emily's kitchen table, the same table where Robert had sat planning seasons, where Emily had sat learning how to save a farm nobody thought she could keep. They talked for 2 hours. Really talked. The kind of conversation that only happens when people stop protecting themselves from the truth. Patricia admitted jealousy, admitted she judged Emily for not marrying, not following the traditional path, admitted watching Emily succeed while her own life got harder had twisted something inside her, made her mean in ways she was ashamed of. Emily admitted loneliness, admitted there were nights she woke up in the empty house and wondered if she'd traded too much for independence, if being right about farming meant being wrong about everything else. They didn't fix everything that afternoon, but they started. And when Patricia left, something had shifted back toward what they'd been before choices and consequences had pulled them apart. The years between 1988 and 1996 passed in the rhythm of seasons: planting and harvest, maintenance and planning, the slow accumulation of equity that comes from working the same ground year after year without extracting more than you return. Emily farmed 600 acres efficiently, keeping her costs low, her debt zero, her reputation as the woman who survived the 80s growing quietly in the spaces between auctions and church services and conversations at the feed store. She never married, not from lack of interest, not from bitterness, just from a clear-eyed understanding that what she'd built required a particular kind of attention, a particular kind of sacrifice, and adding another person's needs to the equation would change the math in ways she wasn't willing to accept. There were men who expressed interest over the years: a widower from the next county who showed up at church occasionally, a divorced banker from Salina who handled some of her transactions, a traveling seed salesman who made a point of stopping by her farm more often than business required. She was kind to all of them, but she didn't let any of them close. The farm demanded everything, and she'd made her choice long ago about what mattered most. In 1991, Emily retired the farm all M, 42 years old, rebuilt twice, still capable of running. But Emily decided it had done enough. She parked it in the shed, covered it with a tarp, kept the Super M for lighter work, and bought a used 1988 John Deere for $32,000, paying cash, still refusing to buy new when used would serve. The day she drove the new tractor home, she spent an hour in the shed with the M, running her hand along the faded red paint, remembering the cold February morning when she'd first gotten it to run, remembering every breakdown it had survived, every harvest it had helped her complete. Machines weren't supposed to mean something, but this one did. Spring of 1996 brought Patricia to Emily's door on a Saturday afternoon, her face carrying the kind of tension that comes from wanting to ask something you're not sure will be answered the way you need. "Emily, I need to ask you something. It's about Michael, your oldest. He graduated from Kansas State last month, agriculture degree." Emily stopped what she was doing, gave Patricia her full attention. "He wants to farm here in Russell County, and he asked if you'd teach him." The request landed like a stone thrown into still water, ripples spreading in directions Emily couldn't immediately trace. Michael Porter, Patricia's son, 22 years old, wanting to learn from a woman his mother had spent years telling him was wasting her life. "What did you tell him?" Patricia's voice came quieter now, weighted with everything this conversation meant. "I told him to ask you himself." Michael showed up the next morning, Sunday, 7 a.m., driving a truck older than he was, dressed in work clothes that looked new. He was tall, sandy-haired, nervous in the way young people are nervous when they're asking for something that matters. "Mrs. Brennan, I'm Michael Porter. My mom said, I know who you are. Your mom and I went to school together. She said you might be willing to teach me about farming, the right way, not just the textbook way." Emily looked at him measuring. He reminded her of herself at 20, that mixture of determination and uncertainty, knowing what you want, but not yet knowing what it costs. Why? Because every professor I talked to at K-State said the only way to make it is to go big, leverage up, expand fast. But I grew up watching those same farmers lose everything in the 80s. My uncle lost his place. My grandfather lost his. I want to learn from someone who didn't. Your mother thought I was crazy for 30 years. She doesn't anymore. Emily let the silence stretch, watching him squirm slightly, testing whether he'd fill it with nervous talk or hold steady. He held steady. "Can you start tomorrow at 5 a.m.? "Yes, ma'am." The apprenticeship lasted 3 years. Emily showed him the journals, both her father's and the one she'd been keeping since 1964. 32 years of data and observations and lessons learned from soil that most people thought was just dirt. She taught him the rotation system, explained why cover crops mattered even when they didn't generate immediate income, showed him the math that proved low debt equals survival. Michael was skeptical at first, the way young people are skeptical of old methods when they've been taught new ones are always better. We have better fertilizers now. We don't need cover crops. Emily didn't argue. She let him test it. Try it your way on that 40-acre section. Try it my way on this one. Compare them after 3 years. He did. Emily's section held moisture better, showed higher organic matter, required fewer inputs, produced steadier yields. Michael's section worked fine for a year, then started showing the stress that comes from treating soil like a resource to extract rather than a system to maintain. By year 3, he converted completely to her methods, understanding, finally, that what looked old-fashioned was actually just proven, tested over decades rather than semesters, built on observation rather than theory. Patricia visited one afternoon in 1998, finding Emily and Michael in the North Field, checking wheat that was just starting to head out. She stood by the fence watching her son listen to Emily explain soil temperature and moisture patterns, watched him take notes in a small book that looked exactly like the ones Robert Brennan had kept. "I was wrong about you, about all of it." Emily walked over, leaning against the fence rail beside her. "You weren't wrong, you chose different. Different isn't wrong, but you were right. I was stubborn." Sometimes stubborn and right look the same. Patricia smiled, a real smile, maybe the first genuine one Emily had seen on her face in years. "And now my son is learning to be just as stubborn. If he wants the land to teach him, he has to be willing to listen that long." They stood together, watching Michael work two women who'd chosen different paths, and both arrived somewhere worth being, even if the destinations looked nothing like what they'd imagined at 20. Donald Morrison passed away in December of 2001. Heart attack. Quick and final, at age 83. Emily went to the funeral, sat in the back, the way she preferred, listened to the pastor talk about hard work and integrity and the businesses that built Russell into what it was. Afterward, Donald's son Ryan found her in the parking lot. "You're Emily Brennan." "I am. My father talked about you, especially toward the end. Said you were the best farmer he ever knew and the worst customer he ever had." Emily smiled at that genuine amusement breaking through funeral solemnity. "That sounds like him." Ryan looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight. "He wanted me to tell you something if I ever got the chance. Said he was wrong about you. Wrong about a lot of things, but especially about you. You can tell him I heard it, even if he's not here to know I did." Ryan nodded, relieved to have delivered the message, and walked back to his car. Emily stood in the cold December air, thinking about the man who'd laughed at her 38 years ago, who'd spent 20 years being proven wrong and still managed at the end to admit it. That took something. Not as much as being right from the start, but something. In spring of 2005, soil scientists from Kansas State came out to Emily's farm as part of a long-term study on sustainable agriculture. They took samples, ran tests, measured topsoil depth and organic matter content, compared her fields to county averages. The results showed what Emily had known but never needed proved. Topsoil depth 12 inches on her land versus 7 countywide. Organic matter 5.8% versus 2.1. Water retention 40% better. Yields consistently higher with lower input costs. The lead scientist, a woman named Dr. Sandra Martinez, asked the question Emily had been waiting for. "What did you do differently?" I listened. Emily showed them the journals, Robert's original and her own. 42 years of continued observations. Dr. Martinez photographed pages, took detailed notes, asked if she could use the data in a paper about multi-generational soil building practices. Emily agreed on one condition. "When we write it up, make sure people understand this didn't happen fast. This took decades. You can't buy this in a bag, and you can't borrow it from a bank. You have to build it one season at a time." Dr. Martinez nodded, scribbling in her notebook. "That's exactly the point we're trying to make. That patience pays off. That there are no shortcuts." "Tell them something else," Emily said. "Tell them it's not just about the soil. It's about knowing what you can afford to lose. Most farmers I knew didn't fail because they didn't know how to farm. They failed because they borrowed too much at the wrong time. Dr. Martinez looked up from her notes. Can I quote you on that? You can. Just make sure they understand I'm not smarter than anyone else. I just had a father who taught me to wait when everyone else was rushing, and a journal that showed me how. The paper was published in 2006. Emily read it once, recognized her father's data translated into academic language, and filed it away. The recognition was nice, but it didn't change anything about the work that still needed doing. In spring of 2008, Emily turned 65. She'd been farming for 45 years, owned 840 acres outright, had 96,000 in savings even after all the land purchases, and was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore. She woke one morning in March and realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept past sunrise, couldn't remember the last time she'd taken a full day off, couldn't remember the last time she'd done something that wasn't dictated by weather or equipment, or the relentless calendar of planting and harvest. The work had given her everything, and taken everything, and she was ready to let someone else carry it forward. She leased the land to Michael Porter and his wife on terms that were more generous than market rate, with a clear path to ownership built into the contract. The conversation happened at her kitchen table, the same table where her father had planned seasons she'd inherit, where she'd learned to read ledgers that told the truth when people lied. Take care of the soil, it'll take care of the rest. Michael held the journal Emily was passing to him, her father's original, treated with the reverence it deserved. Emily, it's not mine to keep, it's for the land. You're just the next person who gets to listen to it. His voice carried weight now, the weight that comes from understanding what you're receiving and what it costs to build. My mom told me she used to think you were wasting your life out here. And what do you think? I think you built something that's going to outlast all of us. Patricia came by one last time before Emily officially signed over the lease, before the last papers were filed and the transition was complete. They sat on the porch looking at the fields, 840 acres of Kansas soil that remembered every seed planted, every cover crop turned under, every season weathered. You remember that day in 1964 when I brought you that casserole and told you to get a job in town? I remember. I was so sure you were making a mistake. I thought I had it figured out. Marry young, have kids, let the man handle the hard stuff. You had 4 beautiful children. That's not nothing. No, but I watched James lose his confidence when we lost some land, watched him become smaller, and I watched you become this. She gestured at the acres, the operation, the legacy Emily had built from $1,000 and stubbornness in a journal she didn't know existed until it was almost too late. I didn't become anything. I just didn't quit. And now my son is going to farm your land, the land you bought with money you saved while I was telling you you'd fail. Patricia's voice carried something between regret and wonder. Life has a sense of humor. Michael's going to be a better farmer than both of us. Because you taught him. Because he wanted to learn. They sat in comfortable silence. 2 women who traveled parallel roads that diverged and reconverged, who judged each other and forgave each other and arrived finally at understanding. The silence stretched, filled with the sound of wind through grass and the distant call of a hawk hunting over the north section. I'm sorry, Patricia said finally, for all those years, for not seeing what you were building, for thinking my way was the only way. I'm sorry, too, for being so hard, for not letting you in when you were trying to help. We were both doing the best we could. We were. Patricia stood, brushing off her skirt. Come visit me in town. Once you're settled, we'll have coffee, real coffee, like we used to. I'd like that. Emily moved into town 3 months later. A small house on Elm Street, 2 bedrooms, quiet neighborhood. She kept the farmhouse for Michael and his family. Watched from a distance as he brought his wife and infant daughter home to land that would teach her what it had taught Emily if she was patient enough to listen. Michael named his daughter Emily, asked permission first, standing in the yard with the baby in his arms, nervous again the way he'd been nervous at 22. That's a lot for a kid to carry. She'll grow into it, same as you did. The baby looked at Emily with dark eyes that didn't blink. taking in the world with the seriousness of someone who didn't yet know enough to be afraid of it. Emily touched the baby's hand, tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb with surprising strength. "You take care of her," Emily said, "and she'll take care of the land. That's how it works." On a clear morning in May of 2008, Emily sat at her kitchen table in town, the new house still smelling of fresh paint and possibility. She'd brought the journals with her, made copies for Michael, but kept the originals because some things shouldn't be given away completely. She opened a new notebook, third in the series, and wrote on the first page in handwriting that was starting to look like her father's. The same careful formation of letters, the same precision. "For whoever comes next, this land doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. Take care of it, and it will take care of you longer than you'll take care of it. Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do, but also don't let anyone tell you you can do it alone. You can't. You'll need the soil, the weather, some luck, and the people who came before you. My father left me a journal. I'm leaving you too. Read them both, then write your own. The work is never finished. That's the point." She signed it carefully. Emily Rose Brennan, Russell County, Kansas, May 2008. She closed the notebook, set it aside for Michael, knowing he'd need it someday when his daughter was old enough to ask questions about where she came from and what it meant to be given land that remembered. Outside, the sun rose over Russell County, over fields that had survived depression and drought and the farm crisis of the 80s, over soil enriched by decades of work most people never saw, over a legacy built so slowly it looked like nothing was happening until suddenly everything had changed. Michael Porter's truck pulled into his driveway 8 miles away, his daughter Emily in the car seat, his wife beside him, his future stretching across 840 acres that would test him and teach him, and if he listened carefully enough, tell him exactly what he needed to know. The land doesn't ask if you are ready, it just asks what you're going to do next. And the answer to that question, written in soil and seasons, in the quiet accumulation of wisdom passed from one generation to the next, mattered more than anyone standing in that moment could fully understand. But they'd learn the same way Emily learned, the same way Robert learned, one season at a time, one decision at a time, one act of faith that tomorrow's ground would remember today's care. Emily stood at her kitchen window looking out at the small yard that was nothing like the field she'd worked for 45 years. But she didn't feel loss. She felt completion. She'd done what her father couldn't finish, built what he'd started, passed it forward to someone who would protect it. The work was never finished. That was the point. That was the gift. That was everything. And somewhere, 8 miles away on land that held 45 years of her sweat and stubbornness, and refusal to quit when quitting would have been easier, a young farmer was learning the same lesson his mentor had learned at 20, that the land doesn't belong to you, you belong to it. And if you're patient enough, careful enough, stubborn enough to listen, it will teach you everything you need to know.